On learning. Learning is a key component in psychology because we need to understand how and why people learn and what motivates people to learn. So there are various theories on this topic, and we'll explore those in this chapter. If you follow the behaviorist theories, you see learning as basically a permanent change in behavior that comes from practice or from experience. And so the behaviorist perspective plays down the role of how we think and of making choices, and that our behavior is a development of our experience that we've had. Now, if you're a cognitive theorist, you'll see learning as the process by which we change the way we look at the environment because of experience. And these changes influence our behavior, but they don't fully determine how we behave. Classical conditioning is a key theory in learning. And this is just a simple form of learning in which we come to anticipate or associate events with one another. Now, Ivan Pavlov in the 1920s made a great contribution to psychology of learning by accident. Pavlov was trying to identify neural receptors in the mouth that triggers a response from the salivary glands. But his dog had an annoying tendency to salivate at times when he wasn't supposed to. And Pavlov was dosing his dogs with meat powder for his research because he knew that salivation in response to meat powder is a reflex. Reflexes are responses that we have. They're unlearned responses that come about by certain stimuli. And so Pavlov discovered that the reflexes can also be learned, or in his words, conditioned by association. So the meat powder was the conditioning that caused the dogs to salivate. And so in his initial experiments, Pavlov trained dogs to salivate when he sounded a tone or a bell. And he termed these trained salivary responses as conditional reflexes. So the reflexes were conditional on the repeated pairing of the clanging with the food, with the meat powder, and that caused the salivation. So today, conditional reflexes are referred to as conditioned responses, or CRs. Some of the key terms to know when it comes to classical conditioning is the neutral stimulus, which is the sound of a bell. And it's neutral because the ringing of a bell to the dog really meant nothing. It wasn't good or bad, it was just the sound of a bell. But when it was paired with the stimulus, which was the food, and then the result was that there was salivation, then the neutral stimulus became connected with the stimulus, and it did cause salivation. Now, when he took away the food and still sounded the bell, the dog still salivated. So the dog had a conditioned response to start salivating whenever the dog heard the bell. So comparison of the two perspectives of classical conditioning. For the behaviorist perspective, the dogs learned to salivate in response to the tone because the tone had been paired with the meat powder. So it's pure learning based on what occurred in the environment. But the cognitive perspective looks at dogs salivating in response to the tone because they mentally connected the tone with meat. So it is a cognitive change that occurred for them that caused the salivation. So again, here are some terms to know for classical conditioning. We have the unconditioned stimulus, which in this case is the meat powder. And the reason it's an unconditioned stimulus is because the dog did not have to learn to salivate with the meat powder. It was just something that happened unconditionally. Salivation in response to the meat powder is an unconditioned response. So that's just a natural thing dogs would do when they come in contact with meat powder. The tone at first is meaningless. So as I said, it's a neutral stimulus. It might have caused the dog to look in a certain direction of the sound, which is simply just a reflex, an orienting reflex. But repeating association with the meat powder with the tone caused the tone to become a conditioned stimulus for salivation. So the dog learned to salivate when he or she heard the tone and became conditioned to salivating in response to the tone. So salivation in response to the tone then is called a conditioned response. It's a learned response. So what happens if you play the bell or a tone for the dog and the dog salivates and then gets the meat powder, but at some point you stop giving the meat powder and all you do is just sound the tone for the dog? Well, eventually the dog may no longer salivate. That's called extinction. That's when the tone which the dog was conditioned to listen to, no longer causes the dog to have the conditioned response, which is salivation. So there's no longer an association between the two. But as time passes, there can be a spontaneous recovery. And so maybe a few months later, the dog has stopped responding to the tone, but all of a sudden the dog hears a tone again and the dog salivates. That's spontaneous recovery. And that's something that helps us adapt to situations that might recur from time to time. Generalization occurs in classical conditioning when we tend to generalize a response to stimuli that are similar. So a tone might elicit some type of salivation, but maybe another noise that's similar to a tone can also stimulate the salivation. So that's generalization. And what we have to do is learn that similar stimuli have different functions, and we have to learn how to respond based on the different stimuli. So discrimination occurs when we learn to discriminate or to tell the difference between stimuli and only respond to the certain stimuli that we've been conditioned to respond to. So how do we apply classical conditioning to our everyday life? And one example is taste aversion. Taste aversions help us because they motivate us to avoid harmful foods. And so if we taste something and it's horrible or it makes us sick, we probably won't try it again. And so that's kind of a survival thing for us. And taste aversions help protect us. And they differ from other kinds of classical conditioning because you only have to try something once and you get sick, and you're going to learn that you're not going to try it again. Or you try something once and it tastes bad, you're probably not going to eat it again. The Little Albert experiment is a famous experiment for classical conditioning, and it's not something that we would do these days, but it does show how you can even learn to have an emotional response to a previously neutral stimuli. So little Albert was a little boy. He was about 11 months old, and he liked animals. He had no problems playing with a laboratory rat. And what Dr. Watson and his future wife did is when little Albert would start playing with the rat, they would clang a loud metal noise behind him and scare him. And so he learned to associate playing with the rat with being fearful, and he quit playing with the rat. But what he also did was start generalizing this to other animals, and so he refused to play with rabbits, and he was afraid of the fur collar on his mother's coat. So this classical conditioning experiment showed that you can learn to associate fear with something that you may not have been fearful of before. Now we can use classical conditioning to help with reducing fear, and this is something that can be done in therapy sessions or working with clients. One such way is counter-conditioning, and in counter-conditioning, we learn to respond to a fearful stimulus in a way that's incompatible with the fearful response. So, for instance, if somebody is afraid of thunderstorms, and every time there's a thunderstorm, they feel like they're about to have a panic attack. Well, if they learn relaxation techniques to use during a thunderstorm, the ability to relax and be calm is not compatible with being afraid. And so learning to do something that opposes the emotion helps with managing the fear. Flooding is another technique that many therapists actually don't use because it can be a little traumatic. And in flooding, a client is exposed to the stimulus that provokes fear until the fear is extinguished. So say if you're afraid of roaches, then you'll be put in a room with a lot of roaches, and you'll just be in that room with all these roaches until you get used to them and you're no longer afraid of them. And you can imagine how traumatic that might be. And yes, at some point you may no longer fear roaches, but there's probably more humane ways of helping clients manage their fears. So an easier way to experience this is systematic desensitization. This technique allows a client to gradually be exposed to the stimuli that provokes fear and learn to relax at each step of the way. So maybe a client who's afraid of heights, you wouldn't take the client up to the 40th floor of a building. Maybe you would just start at the second floor and go up to the second floor, go out on the balcony and try relaxation techniques to counter the fear that they're feeling. And then once they're comfortable on the second floor, go back to the elevator to the stairs and go up to the third floor. And so slowly desensitize the client to the fear rather than doing it all at once, which is what you would do with flooding. Another type of learning is operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning is different from classical conditioning. In operant conditioning, think about operating on the environment. The person has an active role in learning in the environment. So if we do something, then we will get a response, a reward, or a consequence, and that is operant conditioning. Thorndike's law of effect came about by saying that if we do something and there's a pleasant outcome, then we're likely to do it again. If we do something and there's not a pleasant outcome, then we're likely not to do it again. So think about speeding. If you're speeding and you get pulled over and get a traffic ticket, then you probably won't speed, at least in that same area again. But if you're speeding and nothing ever happens to you and you get to where you need to be faster, then you will continue to speed. B.F. Skinner was a student of Thorndike's, and he's the one that really made operant conditioning widely popular among psychologists. During World War II, Skinner proposed that pigeons could be trained to guide missiles to their targets. So in the training, the pigeons were being reinforced with food pellets for pecking at targets projected onto a screen. And once the pigeons were trained, they would be placed into missile, and their pecking at similar targets displayed on the screen would correct the missile's flight path, and it would result in a hit. And the pigeon would be sacrificed, but it showed how pigeons, because they were receiving food pellets, were taught how to do something that was needed to be done during wartime. Ultimately, though, this never came to be. The pigeon equipment was too bulky, and Skinner's suggestion was actually not taken seriously. But it did show how we can be taught to do things for reward, and it will continue, or to get a consequence, and then it will discontinue. So the principles of learning that Skinner applied to the project have wide applications that we now use, both learning in the classroom and in psychology. Skinner taught pigeons, and he also experimented with other animals to gauge an operant behavior. So this is behavior, as I said, that operates on or manipulates the environment. So terms to know in operant conditioning are positive and negative reinforcer. Positive reinforcers increase the probability of a behavior to occur when applied. So if you do something and I give you some candy, chances are you'll do it again. So the candy is a positive reinforcer. A negative reinforcer is we're increasing the probability of a behavior to occur when something is removed. And think about alarm clocks. Alarm clocks are set to start beeping to wake us up in the morning, and we turn them off to stop the noise, and that increases the likelihood that we're going to wake up and get out of bed. So positive reinforcers, it's something that we add to increase the behavior. Negative reinforcers is something that we take away to increase the behavior. Reinforcers can also be immediate or delayed. And so short-term consequences for our behavior are more of an incentive than long-term consequences. If we can get reinforcers immediately, we're more likely to engage in the behavior than if we have to wait a long time. This is why, for example, crash diets are so popular, because people want to go on a diet and immediately lose weight. They don't want to just make little changes and lose weight over a long period of time. Within reinforcers, you can have primary reinforcers, and these are effective because it is things related to our biological makeup and not so much on learning. So reinforcer of food, if somebody's hungry, food is going to motivate them to do something because biologically it's just what our body needs. And the same with warmth and pain. Secondary reinforcers are things that we learn to want. So money is an example of this. When you're a little kid and somebody gives you money, you don't know what it is. It's just something to rip apart and to play with. But as you get older, you begin to associate money with the ability to buy things, the ability to have more freedom. And so you are conditioned to learn that money is something that's valuable and that you're willing to work for. So that's a secondary reinforcer. So reinforcers are stimuli that increase the frequency of behavior. So if we want something to continue, we reinforce it. Punishments, on the other hand, are things that decrease the frequency of behavior. And there's two kinds of punishment: positive punishment and negative punishment. So positive punishment is when we do something to decrease unwanted behavior. Now remember, punishments, the idea of punishment is to decrease behavior. So a positive punishment, we add something to decrease behavior. Negative punishment, we take something away to decrease behavior. So a positive punishment could be spanking. So if something happens, I'm going to add something, which is a spank, and hopefully that will decrease the behavior. Negative punishment could be taking away a toy. So you behave a certain way, I'm going to take away a toy from you in hopes that your behavior will be different next time. In operant conditioning, some responses continue because there's a continual reinforcement that's given. So every time a child cleans his room, then he's given 30 minutes of computer time. That's continuous reinforcement. You clean your room, you get 30 minutes of computer time. But we can also maintain behavior by partial reinforcement. So every time you clean the room, then sometimes you get computer time, sometimes you don't. You don't know, but you have to clean your room to find out. Now, partial reinforcement is more resistant to extinction. Remember, extinction is when the behavior disappears. So behaviors that are partially reinforced tend to continue longer because the person does not know whether or not a reinforcement is coming. When there's continuous reinforcement, if as soon as the reinforcement stops, then the person's behavior might stop because they realize nothing is coming, because every time I do this, I get reinforced. I'm not getting reinforced right away again, so I'm not going to do it. Whereas with partial reinforcement, you continue the behavior in hopes that this is the time you will receive the reinforcer. So when we provide a reinforcement, we can provide it in different ways. There's a fixed interval schedule and a variable interval schedule. Now, in a fixed interval schedule, a fixed amount of time must pass before the correct response results in a reinforcer. So if I tell a child you need to study for an hour today, but every 15 minutes you can take a break and have a snack, that's a fixed interval schedule. So a certain amount of time, 15 minutes, has to pass before you receive the reinforcement. The reinforcement is more unpredictable if I were to use a variable interval schedule. So you have to study for an hour, and maybe after 10 minutes you get a snack, maybe after 30 minutes you get a snack. The time changes before the reinforcer is given. The interval schedule of reinforcement has to do with time. We're looking at either a fixed amount of time or a variable amount of time before there's a reinforcer. There's also a ratio schedule of reinforcer, and this has to do with the person actually doing something before a reinforcer is given. So it has nothing to do with time, but after this, so many behaviors, then you get a reinforcement. And again, there's two types. There's fixed ratio schedule, and that's where reinforcement is given after a fixed number of correct responses. So I'm going to give you a quiz, and every time you get 5 questions correct, then you get a sticker. That's a fixed ratio. So it depends on you actually answering the questions. Whether it takes you 5 minutes or 45 minutes, it doesn't matter. We're waiting for you to answer 5 questions correctly before you get your reinforcement of a sticker. The second type of ratio is the variable ratio schedule. So that's where reinforcement is provided after a certain amount of responses one time and then another amount of responses another. So if you give me 5 correct answers, you might get a sticker. If you give me 7 correct answers, you might get a sticker. You're going to get reinforced, but you don't know how many correct answers you have to get before you receive the sticker. So to review, you have fixed interval and variable interval, and that's related to time, whether it's the same amount of time or the time varies. And then you have fixed ratio and variable ratio, and that has to do with the response of the person. So think about operant conditioning in terms of relationships. If you're in a relationship with somebody and this person tells a joke and you laugh every time this person tells a joke, well, you're encouraging the person to continue telling jokes because you're offering a reinforcement of laughter. Now, if you laugh only after a certain amount of time of jokes, then the person might continue telling jokes or maybe not. If you don't laugh at all, then the person hopefully would stop telling the jokes. So in any relationship you have, we use operant conditioning to let people know, yes, I like this, keep doing it, or no, I don't like this, I want you to stop doing it. And that's just based on your response to the person. So this is definitely something that we use every day. Shaping is another operant conditioning term, and reinforce somebody reaching a goal through little steps. So successive approximation of the goal are reinforced. Think about potty training. A toddler needs to be potty trained. And so we don't just say, okay, your goal is to use the toilet correctly at the right time, and then you get your reward. We do shaping. So we might say, all right, when you feel like you have to go potty, let me know. And that in itself is a big step, because then the child is starting to recognize the sensation of needing to go potty. When you're able to make it to the bathroom before you go potty, then that could be something that's rewarded. When you're able to pull down your pants, when you're able to sit on the toilet. So you just take small steps along the way, and you're shaping the behavior to teach the toddler how to start using the potty. Another theory of learning is observational learning. And this is when we acquire skills simply by observing others. So if we grow up in a home where there's a lot of violence, then we learn the skill of violence by simply observing our family members. Or if we grow up in a home where people talk out their problems and nobody ever hits each other, then that's another skill we learn by observing others. So basically, we are modeling the behavior we see in others, and this behavior is reinforced. So observational learning is a cognitive theory of learning. We're watching people, and based on what we see, that's how we learn how to behave. And Albert Bandura was a theorist who came up with observational learning, and he did this through his experiments with a bubble doll. And in a bubble doll, children would watch adults interact with this doll, and some of the adults were aggressive and some weren't. And then these children were put in a room with the same doll, and their behaviors were observed. And what they found is the children that were observing aggressive behaviors between adults and the bubble doll also showed aggressive behaviors with the bubble doll. And children who were kinder to the doll, or children who saw adults being kinder to the doll, were themselves kinder to the doll when they were left alone with the doll. So that's Albert Bandura's theory of observational learning, that we tend to imitate what we see. So our learning theories, we had classical conditioning with Ivan Pavlov and John B. Watson. Pavlov had the salivating dogs, and Watson had little Albert with the rats. We had operant conditioning with Thorndike and his law of effect, and B.F. Skinner teaching us about how we operate on the environment, how our responses are affected by reinforcement. And then we had observational learning with Albert Bandura, showing us that we tend to learn by watching others. So those are the theories of learning, and we use a lot of these in psychology. We use a lot of these when working in counseling sessions, and basically understand human nature and behavior. So that's it for this chapter. I hope you all have a great week, and please contact me with any questions.